Hey, welcome back to the Papers Podcast. All the co-hosts are here. We scan the health professions education literature and enrich your week with our selections. Well, most of us do. But today, it's John's paper. First, I want to introduce our usual crew. We're all here. We're a bit punchy. We've had some gremlins in the recording works today, so it's made us even more punchy than usual. Lava, how are you?
Hey, everybody. I'm doing well. Hope you are too.
Linda, how are you?
Are you paying me to be here?
Oh, yes.
And if you're paying her, we got to talk.
John, you have a cool paper, you said. I think it's a short paper. Tell us why you picked this paper and where are you taking us?
Well, who was it? Was it Mark Twain that said, I apologize for the long letter. I didn't have enough time to write a short one. So short papers sometimes have big impacts. I'm not sure if I'm misattributing that quote, but someone smart or someone old, probably someone dead, said something like that. I've entitled this episode, No Free Lunch versus I'm in Debt and Hungry, the debate on industry and education. And I've gone to a clinical journal because often we are in our silo looking at the health professions education journals, but I've gone to JAMA and the first author is Hogan. The paper was published in late 2023. And so I want to use it as an introduction to an age-old debate on where we all sit on the residents and their connection or tie to industry and pharma. So it's an easy headline to take, and certainly some of us could be the social justice posturing warriors if we wanted and say, you know what, there should be a true church and state type of differentiating. But we should probably think about how industry does influence our health systems. Think of COVID, cough, 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 and what happened there. So here's a bunch of questions I want to throw to you, and I want you to take them as you might, but what's the responsibility of a residency training program to limit industry connections to physicians in training? Should it be paternalistic and sheltered? Should the approach be hands-off and only guided by criteria? What's the impact on professional identity? What does transitioning out of a training program into actual clinical practice mean? And what does that transition look like? Is there a responsibility for faculty supervisors or mentors? If your program is underfunded, which I think is probably the norm around the world, what are the resource implications for connection or no connection to industry? There's lots of ways to take that headline of no free lunch. How do you think about it? And I'll go Linda, Jason, Lara.
You know, when I was chief resident, the worst part of my job was having to go talk to pharma people to try and get them to fund lunches for the residents' rounds. I really didn't like that. Interestingly, as someone who graduated after me and made a lot of money, donated a fair chunk of money to the residency program to pay for the lunches so we wouldn't have to go to pharma. Wow. Because they felt so strongly about it. And I think until recently, that's still going on. Now, why isn't it still going on now? Because everything's done online. So you cook your own lunch anyway.
So my answer to this is that it's moot because I'm an emergency physician in Canada and no one cares. So there is no industry interaction with any of the programs in my world. My longer answer is that I do think that a guideline is needed. There are policies at all of our institutions, at least a lot of the ones that I interact with, that severely limit the interaction between trainees and industry. There are some conditions where that would be enabled. There are some unrestricted educational grant opportunities, but the opportunities to tag an event, to have an industry kind of influence on a session, severely limited. And you just don't see that very often.
Can I just say, you don't see it very often officially, but I still see dermatology, for instance, residents being taken out for really nice dinners at conferences, not in medicine.
I think
so maybe it's by specialty.
Yeah, it might be by specialty. I also think it's different in different places. While I'm Canadian born and bred and trained, I live in the U.S. now, and things are different down here. And I think there's another piece of this that we have to take into consideration. Like, there's industry interests, there's medical education interest, and there's also medicine's interest. And each of those groups has a different purpose, has a different expectation, need, requirement. And at the nexus of those three is where the space we're talking about. So quite frankly, John, to answer any of your questions, I don't know. But what I do know is that we can't pretend that that space is non-existent, and we have to think about it. I'm a big fan of free will, want to give everybody agency, period. That's important. I also think that if we don't recognize that industry is going to show up to do what industry wants, which is to make money, right? They have an interest in financial gain. That's why industries exist. And we can't pretend that they don't look at the medical space and think about how they're going to make money off of patients, because they are. That's what they do. And that's fine. There's reasons why we have great new pharmaceutical innovations. There's a reason we have great devices. There's money in the space to be used for research and purposes and all sorts of things. But the purposes for education, the purposes for medicine are different. And I think the other part of this is we have to remember that part of our mandate, part of the reason that medicine is self-regulated is that we have a contract with society. So we have many responsibilities then to take care of individual patients and society and to worry about how big pharma can create situations like we saw down here in the US where the opioid crisis can be traced back to all kinds of very specific decisions by a series of individuals. And that's a problem. And so for me, there needs to be policies, there needs to be agency, but more than anything, there needs to be teeth. Because if you do something that's ethically questionable or unethical, there needs to be ramifications, because right now they ain't there.
So I think we've set up this problem well, and I'm going to suggest that we get out of the hypothetical discussion into something actually supported by data. And just to foreshadow a little bit, I've been doing some reading about English terminologies, Labas, just so you feel good. Foreshadow, is that a thing? All right, yeah?
Yes, foreshadow's good. Feeling loved.
So
thank you.
An English major feels connected.
Yay.
I think we're going to hear a shocking number, but then the shocking number might be pulled back and maybe not as terrible as we might imagine. And I think it has some implications for what are the resources and how is industry engaging. And then it leads us to the questions that we've all raised, so we can get some data to inform our discussion. So,
wait a second, John. Sorry to interrupt you. Did you just throw down the gauntlet that this is an episode where we're all throwing out English terminology to make Lava happy? Is that what we're doing?
If that's the case, Jason, you better load your Google and start saying, what are big words that I don't know? And anything you don't realize that has a bunch of vowels in it, probably fine for you.
Spell onomatopoeia in your Google search. Yeah.
I think this is all hubris. Boom.
Oh, well done. Fatal flaw.
Jason's big word was 5 letters long.
Boom. Yeah, but it's the pride thing.
It's
It's
6 letters.
anyway.
6 letters. I counted wrong.
We can't even count at this point.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's not the size that counts. You guys should know that.
Awkward
Oh.
pause. Awkward pause.
Let's
moving forward.
Let's edit that out.
For Lara's laugh, maybe we shouldn't.
Let's edit that out. All
Hey,
right, John.
anyway, back
For
to the
the
show.
outtakes episode.
So let's
Go,
jump right to methods. It's a cross-sectional retrospective study using an American program called the Open Payments Program Database that has reporting for all industry payment to U.S. healthcare professionals. The caveat here, though, is that reporting payments to residents is not mandatory. And the authors very appropriately highlight and redline this right in the start that says their data probably is an underrepresentation of the actual phenomenon in the US. So in the year 2020 to 2021, they took the 3 largest primary care programs, internal medicine, family medicine, and OB/GYN, and the 3 largest surgical specialties, general surgery, orthopedic surgery, and urology. And they looked at the programs, residents and faculty program directors. They used a modified Poisson regression to determine the association of the resident link variable, so payment, to the acceptance of payments, the independent variable. The reference group, so those that received the fewest payments, was the comparator. So that was internal medicine, female gender, and a federally owned institution. Before I get into the data, what do you want to hear about in terms of the methods?
What do we want to hear about?
Yeah, what was that fish you just talked about? Poisson?
The Poisson. Poisson.
We have no idea what it does, but it's poisson.
It smells, that's
Those
for
methods
sure.
are fishy.
Do you want to hear a little bit about what a Poisson regression is? Yeah?
No.
No?
Yeah, totes.
You can look it up.
Dudes, no, we're an educational podcast. Let's have a few minutes on poisson, please.
Okay.
Croissant or poisson?
So
I'll take a croissant while we're talking about poisson.
right now, there's a bunch of French speakers that are just like rolling their eyes and unfollowing our show as we speak.
Cringing. Yeah.
So I'm not a psychometrician, although apparently I'm going to play one on this podcast. Remember, what a regression tries to do is to try to find or predict an independent variable. So in this case, did you receive payment using dependent variables, the type of program, your gender, your specialty. And if you think back to basic math in like grade 8, where you had an X and Y and you plotted some pieces of data on a line, you would try to find, can I connect all these little data points on an X and Y graph? The mathematical equation that shows here is the line that connects point A, B, C through to X, that's a regression. A Poisson regression uses a specific type of data, which is basically counts. In this instance, how many payments were received. And it assumes a couple things. The data is going to be normally distributed, and that the average score remains consistent, meaning the variance around that average score, so the mean is different. Put another way is, if you're a general surgery program in, put it in Chicago. In this program, you received 3 payments in March, 3 payments in April, 4 payments in June, 2 payments in July. Your variance around your score is pretty tight. You're somewhere around 3.5. That needs to work for the math to work. And so what Poisson regression says, we can then predict the likelihood that you will accept payment from pharma based on these dependent variables, your gender, your program, and your specialty. I've put Linda definitely to sleep. Her eyes are closed. Does anybody else want to comment on methods before we move on to the who cares?
I just want to say that I'm gonna keep this segment for when I have insomnia, because I think this will help me a lot. John's voice doing stats.
That would be a fair thing.
All right, let's go on.
Okay. Too long didn't read. In a special type of data point, Poisson regression helps you to determine what's the likelihood that this will happen based on your dependent variables. Okay? So They looked at more than 65,000 residents, of which almost half were female, with the bulk of them, about 30,000, being internal medicine trainees. So we have previously talked about big data. This doesn't count as big data from the science point of view, but this is a big data set of what they're using. 2/3 of the training program were private, non-profit organizations, which I think shows a special type of context in the US, where in Canada, they are all publicly funded, publicly owned training programs. You'll have to look at your own geography and say, what does it look like? Are there private training programs where you make sense? And this might be one of those features that relates to the likelihood of industry funding. In that 1-year study period, 27,000 payments were made, and 22% of all residents received money, up to $6.5 million in aggregate, of which there was a subset of around 13% that received more than 2/3 of that. So there is a small cohort within the larger set of residents where all the money is flowing to. 40% of program directors received money, more than $5 million. You got to decide on scope and scale whether that means something to you. Looking now at the a priori defined dependent variables, orthopedic surgery received the most payments, 2.2 million to their residents, 4 million to the program directors, and obstetrics gynecology received the least, not quite 70,000 to the residents, and not quite 200,000 to the program directors. So you can see logarithmic differences there between programs. The median payment to residents was $64, and the maximum was $50,000. To program directors, it was $120 with a maximum over $400,000. Dun dun dun. There is something evil afoot, right? Which is how how we kind of might have imagined what's actually happening. But now, let me do the reveal. that 90% of this went to funding food and drink. So we're going to have rounds and you're going to get pizza and Diet Coke. 8% was for education. And then there was 10 residents who received research grants ranging from $10 to $50,000. So what do you think of the results now? Is it a much more nuanced discussion that we need to have, or is big pharma really evil pharma? Lara, Linda, Jason.
So what we can say about big data because of the quality of the data that's within it. So first of all, the fact that was it orthopedic surgery and urology are earning, like they're accepting 3 times as much money as internal medicine. That's a bit of a concern. There's something there. And so I had some concerns about that. But then as you read the data more carefully, you can see that there's perhaps a reason for this off-kilterness, right? Because 2 urology residents received $50,000 grants, and 5 orthopedic surgeon residents received 20,000 grants. So if grants are getting mixed in with the money that we're talking about as incentives, then maybe it's not as bad as it seems.
Rhetorical question.
That's interesting. Actually, the way I interpreted this simplistically is that orthopedic surgical residents eat more than internal medicine residents. You could look at it that way. They get more money, but most of the money is spent on food and drink. There's also the question of expectations. You know, do you expect to have food and drink around? And then there's the other part, the policy part that Lara was talking about. What else goes on along with the pizza? You know, are there drug detail people standing in the background wanting to talk to you about a device or a drug? Or are they putting some literature out about their latest pharma invention? We don't know that.
So I agree with what Linda just said. This data was actually reassuring. So first of all, I don't think all industry is evil. I think there's, as Lara has said before, there's just competing interests sometimes. Having said that, this data says that if you take the grants out, it's a really pretty small number. And what it sounds like with this open payments database is that a conscientious pharma rep or industry rep would pay for lunch and then need to get all the names of all the residents so they could enter them in this database to say, yeah, this resident had pizza and I'm conscientiously reporting because of this legislation. And then if you divide by the number of people who had pizza, then like for one specialty, I think it was 79 cents per trainee or something like that. And then for others, it was like $12. And so, you know, it's not a lot of money. That's one perspective, right? Some would argue that as if you're a purist, any money from industry doesn't belong in a training program, but it certainly is not as pervasive as I assumed it would be when I started with the headline of this paper. Now, the big fatal flaw is that it's not mandatory, I understand, under this legislation to report interactions with trainees. It's only mandatory for practitioners. So who knows what the actual numbers are? This is the best possible data available.
So here's my kind of take. I think, and to balance everything that I've heard so far, and it starts with this assumption, it's voluntary reporting. So if you're evil pharma, you're probably not putting your evil machinations down on paper. So we need to take all of this with a grain of salt. But the analysis that doesn't get pulled out as directly as I would have liked, and certainly not in the headline of the paragraph of the first part of the results section or in the first paragraph of the discussion, is this. But I have included the table 3 in the abstract. So here's a shameless plug to go to the Papers podcast and look at our abstract, where you too can find table 3 if you don't have access to JAMA. It's this. If you are in a government-funded program, the likelihood that your program will receive funding is nil. So there is no increased risk. But if you're in a private nonprofit residency training program, you have twice the probability that you will accept payment from pharma. And if you're in a for-profit residency training program, 3.5 times. And so we come back to our big kind of abstract generic conversation of the relationship between physicians in training and industry needs to be one that is addressed with appropriate guidelines, appropriate understanding of the fiduciary relationship as a healthcare professional we have for our patients. I do wonder if in the for-profit or in the private not-for-profit types of programs, is there that same driver to be thoughtful about how to structure payments or not? This data is not really pulled out, but it's something that I found kind of interesting. Lara, you had something to respond with.
So one thing that I just want to one thing that we haven't touched on yet, and I just want to make sure that is part of the conversation, is that we're thinking about the culture of integrity in which these different learning spaces, these learners are embedded. Because I think one of the things that this data is showing us is that the context matters. And if context matters, then that means that we have to be thinking about, in our context, how are we putting policy and role models and still enabling agency around an ethics of integrity? Because I don't personally think any learner or faculty member or any clinician, quite frankly, walks into a room and says, how am I going to make money from industry today? I don't believe that. Maybe I choose not to believe that, but that's not the point. The point is that culture matters.
Preach. Not a rhetorical question, just a good statement. Let me go to the conclusion from the authors. I'll give them the last word. Approximately, and they have a different denominator, so I readjusted the math. So approximately 22% of residents were reported to have accepted industry payments in an academic year. That's in the US. That proportion could be an understatement because the reporting is strictly voluntary. Specialty, program director behavior, and sponsoring institution control were associated with residents accepting industry payments. Sponsored group meals appear to account for a large portion of payments, suggesting these programs condone these types of trainee industry interactions. So that's the data to inform your own philosophical and principle-based discussion about the connection between industry and education. Let's go to our round of votes on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of methods. Remember, you all got a stats lesson and survived. What say you? Jason, Lara, Linda?
Well, I enjoyed the Poissons, so I actually think this is as good as they could have done from public databases such as the ours. I can give it a 4.
So I have to abstain because I am not qualified to make any judgments about the methods provided. I just can't.
I jump in about autoethnography all the time with abandon.
Seriously.
I'm demonstrating intellectual humility here. I don't know. I can't make assessment.
Well, I have no clue what the Poisson, whatever it was, or whether it was Poisson or Croissant, is beside the point. One is more curved than the other. But I think they described what they did quite well.
Yeah.
And you're right, Jason. They did the best they could, given that the data was most likely incomplete. But I would say this is good. So I'll give it a 3.
I thought they did a great job. It's a bit of work. I don't see anything wrong with their methods. It's not their fault that the data is incomplete in a voluntary reporting. It's the limit of the data, and they appropriately tell us, but at least they can give us the best description, which is only a partial description of what reality is here. So in terms of a methods point of view, I'm going to give it a 5. Let's turn to educational impact, and we'll go reverse order this time.
Oh, that's like an intellectual, that's an IQ test right there. Who was last?
Linda.
Okay.
Linda, Lara, Jason.
There's 3 of us.
Is that a subtle dig at IQ? I'm not sure what that was supposed to be.
So I was last, and I will
That
go
was
first.
Intellectual humility right there.
Right there.
Yes.
Right there. I'm not afraid to admit I have no idea.
Okay. So I was last, and I will go first. This is an important paper. I'm going to give it a 4 because it's clear that in some contexts, and I don't think it's only in the US, in some other countries I've worked in, pharma still has a very close hand-in-glove relationship with practitioners with a risk of bias. My question, after having given it a 4, is how are you going to get trainees to go to sessions, particularly sessions that are often middle of the day or at another mealtime, unless you feed them?
So I'm assuming I'm second. So I'm going to give this paper. Come on, Jason, you love me for who I am.
Brain is big as a planet, but
I'm really good at very small scope of things, very small scope
Count
of
to
things,
three.
and there's everything else.
And do it. Okay.
No, well, it's been a long day already. You know what? This is medical education research in JAMA. Like, that's a goal, life goal for me. And I think, if nothing else, it has started a really important conversation. This is something we need to be wrestling with. So I'm going to give it a 5.
whoa.
Yeah,
Whoa.
why not?
Unusually generous and a number. First of all, it's JAMA open. I am thrilled that they're, this workout out there. The test for me about impact is whether or not I'd use this paper again. And it would be a very limited, number of reasons that I would pull this paper out. So it's a 3. It's a solid paper on an important topic. And it makes basically 1 point about prevalence. So it's a 3.
But your definition.
It was so logical.
Your definition of impact is very limited definition, though, Jason.
But so reproducible and so logical. Come on, I'm sitting beside lava on the screen, and you're criticizing my logic on this scale. How is that fair?
I gave a sheepadoodle once on the scale. What else can you ask
All
for?
right,
Exactly.
kids, I'm going to wrap this up and get us home. All right, I think this is current state for the U.S. I think it tells us some really interesting phenomenon, particularly in the type of residency training program and the funding model there, and offers us potentially some caution. So I'm going to give this a 4. So there you have it. You can find out more about our past episodes, read past abstracts. You can reach us and find us on the interwebs at paperspodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. You can reach us by email at thepaperspodcast@gmail.com. And before we sign off, we do have a listener fan mail, and I wanted to give a bit of a shout out and a congratulations to Elsa McDonald. I hope I know I got your name wrong, so Elsa, I apologize, but you wrote to us and we're thankful that the Papers Podcast was part of a whole raft of resources that you're using as part of your University of Dundee master's dissertation, which, congrats, you completed and submitted before turning 50. So you had both an academic and a life celebration all within the course of the year.
Yay!
Congrats.
You were very encouraging to us at the Papers Podcast. And I'll tell you that that's really the currency that keeps us going. So thanks so much for reaching out to us. And we wish you great success in your continuing role as a member of the pharmacy team at the NHS Education for Scotland. With that,
That's huge.
very huge.
Yep.
So
Congrats.
Yay!
a round of applause and congrats for your completion. And with that, thanks for listening.
Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. You've been listening to the Papers Podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter. The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sorrow. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers Podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you for all you do. Take care.
I'm just going to get rid of the phones, okay? I'll be 1 sec while I throw the phones out of the room.
Yep.
Okay.